There we go. And the first thing I want to do is just welcome everybody. And we're just delighted to have all our Hampshire Bird Club members here and the person from Connecticut, as well as people from the Allen and Hoffman Bird Clubs. It's really, we love this feeling of community here. Just a couple of little housekeeping things before I introduce Pam. As I just said, we record these workshops. We post a link on our website, usually 3 or 4 days after the workshop. So you can always go to it and review it if you like. And the recordings also go onto our YouTube channel. So I just want to be sure everybody knew that. My next, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Janice will monitor the chat, and at the end, she'll let you ask your question, and she'll just make sure, she'll just keep track of everybody's questions. It also helps sometimes during the workshop because things go out of your brain. If you put it in the chat, then hopefully it won't go out of your brain. The last thing is we would ask everyone to please mute yourselves so that we really have the best sound quality for our workshop. And so I would like to introduce Pam Hunt, our guest this evening. She has been interested in birds since the tender age of 12, when an uncle took her to Brigantine National Wildlife Refuge in New Jersey. And then she went on to earn a BS in biology from Cornell University, MA in zoology from University of Montana, and a Ph.D. from Dartmouth. Pam came to she's at the New Hampshire Audubon. She came to New Hampshire Audubon in 2000, and in her current position as Avian Conservation Biologist, she works closely with New Hampshire Fish and Game to coordinate and prioritize bird research. And she also works with monitoring birds in the state. She authored New Hampshire's State of the Birds Report. And her specific areas of interest include habitat use by early successional birds, particularly whippoorwills, conservation of aerial insectivores like swifts and swallows, and the effects of events outside the breeding season on long-distance migrants. So it's a really fascinating and a great breadth of research that she brings to us. And now we will get to hear about birding in New Hampshire.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. We'll see how this works. I've got 2 screens here, and hopefully one of them will be the one that shows my presentation in a second. But I also thought I'd mention ahead of time a little caveat that this is a talk that I made just because you guys asked me to make it. So it might be far from perfect. So I will happily take comments on its flow and things like that, because I hopefully will be able to make it useful for future folks. And if there is like a super, I will sometimes keep an eye on the chat as well, because sometimes questions are going to be more useful when I'm actually saying something rather than what I said 20 minutes ago when someone asked that question. So I will potentially keep an eye on it a little bit myself as well. And we'll see what happens. So with no further ado, I will share my screen. Where did the share my, have I got privileges to share?
You should, I'll double check.
I do not see, oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's in a different place. There's like 3 different ways of doing this. Is that showing?
Yes, it is.
Perfect.
Excellent. Plus, hopefully that little bar on the top, I can usually get that to go away, can't you? Anyway, we'll see what happens. You think we'd have this figured out by now? We've been doing talks with Zoom for 3 years. So welcome to New Hampshire. Who here has been birding in New Hampshire? We could put it in the chat, maybe, I don't know.
Raise your hand if you know how to do that.
Yeah, I can do weird things like change the grid here. So it's kind of fun to make this interactive a little bit. Maybe not too many by looks of things. But anyway, okay, well, you're all going to come after I give this talk, presumably. So we will go from there. So we're a pretty small state, but we've got a huge amount of habitat diversity, as indicated by my little subtitle here. And, I'm going to try to cover that in a somewhat logical fashion. Oh, great. This is always what happens too when all right, there we go. In a logical fashion, starting from the coast and working our way inland and then north. For those of us who spend a lot of time birding in Hampshire, we kind of divide it into a few little regions. I'm going to try to focus on these. Oh, come on. Weird. Okay, well, there's supposed to be a little bunch of lines drawing on this map, and they seem to have disappeared. But to keep it simple, we've got our little tiny bit of coast. We have very little coast compared to our neighbors and states to the south, like 13 miles, depending how you want to define it, but we're very proud of it. So we'll start talking about the coast. Then we're going to head inland to the sort of area of the state south of the White Mountains. And then we'll jump north to the northern half of the state, which is often where folks from, south of the border are most interested in coming for various reasons, because there's cool birds up there that aren't in southern New England. Just a little breakdown. I might mention county names now and then. You're not going to have a quiz on which counties are which. And the basic plan for this talk, which will be deviated from on a regular basis, is that, when we're birding, we want to know a bunch of things like where are we going to go birding, when are we going to go birding, and what do we want to see. And those three things can combine in various ways. And we will see, as I said, how my way of structuring this talk to answer those questions will actually work. So we'll start on the coast. Pretty small coast, but we've got, a nice little piece of ocean, a little bit of coastline, and then inland. We got a few places that are essentially tidal that have some interesting things going on with them. We're going to sort of just poke around at all these locations here to some degree or another. I'm not going to be giving details on exact locations to find things. At the very end, I'll show a link to a friend's book, but might have some information on that. And of course, there's all sorts of resources these days like eBird to go in and find locations to go birding if you happen to be in a certain part of the state on some sort of trip. So we'll start offshore, because we do have an offshore. Not much of it, but we do. And, there's a couple of ways people, in terms of the where or how, in this case, get offshore. There are regular whale watch boats that go off of the coast in the non-whale watch season from, October through March, depending on other factors. There is a fishing charter that people sometimes take out to look for birds in the winter. With the caveat, of course, that when they find fish, they stop and you're kind of stuck in the water. And several birder friends of mine have taken to fishing as well when they're on these trips. You can usually get your usual selection of pelagic birds, depending what time of year you're going. If you're in the summer, you're going to get your mix of shearwaters and storm petrels, like in the upper left. If you're going during the fall migration, September, October into maybe November, when you need to be on a fishing boat, you will get the things like Jaegers and phalaropes that are moving through. And in the winter, you can get alcids. People have been getting out there a fair bit this past winter and seeing lots of common mirrors like this one. Puffins, dovekies, all those sorts of things that you usually aren't going to see from shore. Spring migration, starting around now into June, is probably the quietest time of year, because the winter birds have left. The southern birds, which are summer birds, which are mostly southern hemisphere breeders, haven't got here yet. And every time there's been a May pelagic trip, it's not necessarily had a lot of interesting birds on it. But there's some cool birds out there. Let's move a little closer to land, or at least a little bits of land that stick out. There are a little group of islands called the Isles of Shoals. This is White and Seavey Island, which are shared between Maine and New Hampshire, located about 7-8 miles offshore. There's a little map of them. The biggest ones tend to be in Maine, but we got a couple of noteworthy ones in New Hampshire, Star Island and White and Seavey Island. Most of them are not publicly accessible. That's one of the challenges, but Star Island is. There's the same people that run the whale watches have a little ferry that goes out there to take people up there. Star Island is privately owned, but it has a retreat center run by the Unitarian Church. I think it's the Unitarians that has programs up there, and you can go out there for the day and wander around and come back on a later boat kind of thing. If you go to Star Island, you're mostly going to be going there from probably late April into early October, whenever the boats are running. And in the summer, it's not terribly exciting. You're going to have a bunch of breeding gulls and eiders. But in the spring and fall migration, these islands can be little hotspots for warblers and other migrants that are just been migrating over the Gulf of Maine and see a little bit of land in the morning and say, oh God, thank God I'm exhausted and I'm going to crash here. And on a good day, you can have all sorts of crazy things out there. We've got a record of Cassin's sparrow from Star Island, for example. In the winter, if the weather works and the Isles of Shoals Christmas count happens, people land on Star Island and walk around a little while. And that's one of the most reliable places to find things like king eider and harlequin duck in the winter in New Hampshire, because otherwise they're pretty scarce on the immediate seacoast. So that's Star Island. And then you can't get to see the island, but it's a worthwhile story to tell briefly, because it's the site of what's now the largest tern colony in the Gulf of Maine. And boat trips to the islands will sometimes go around the island. You can look at the tern colony. There's about 3,000 common terns pairs, about 100 pairs of roseate terns, 1 to 2 Arctic terns. They're southern to the range. And this colony wasn't there in 1995. Audubon and Fish and Game started a project to attract terns by putting up decoys, playing tern noises. And that year, 5 nested, and now there's 3,000 pairs. So it's a pretty cool conservation success story. A few other things that are out there include a handful of black guillemots in the islands in general, and American oyster catchers, which only in the last 3 or 4 years have actually started nesting on the Isles of Shoals as they've been recovering along the Atlantic coast. And you can see any of these birds, on day trips around the islands in the summertime. So now we'll head into the mainland. One of the crown jewels, probably, of birding in the New Hampshire seacoast is Odeon Point State Park at the extreme northern tip. Someone just found a summer temperature there yesterday that it was still there today. It's a nice big state park with forests, a bit of wetlands, lots of ocean frontage. And as you go south on the Route 1A from Odeon, there's a whole bunch of access points for state beaches, pull-offs along the road. You can look at the ocean, look at the marshes. So it's for a state with limited coastline, that part of our coast is very accessible for birders in general. And you can spend tons of time having fun looking for things there. Just a few little fun samples. So there's a Chuck Will's widow there that showed up last May. The very first Chuck Will's widow that most people in the state that wanted to could see. Odeon is also famous in good weather, bad weather actually, for little warbler fallouts. Kind of looks like the Isles of Shoals where, the weather is bad, the birds out in the ocean, they all come in and they just crash and land in the trees there and forage looking for yummy goodies. So during spring migration and fall migration to a lesser extent, it can be a very good place. It's one of the better places in the state to find a chat in September and October. And then the entire coast south of there is good for your standard coastal things from, fall migration through spring, a lot of wintering birds like sea ducks, like these long-tailed ducks, good numbers of wintering purple sandpipers, and, all those other kinds of birds that you might find on a coastal trip. So, and even the Gulf of Maine. At the southern end of the state's coast is the Hampton-Seabrook Estuary, which is our largest extent of salt marsh. Nice big tidal range here, close to low tide. And this is, if you want to look for shorebirds in New Hampshire, this is the place to go. At low tide, they'll be foraging in the mudflats. At high tide, they'll be hiding up in various little salt pans or cobble bars on the immediate coast. And as far as the when goes, here's a little graph based on some eBird data, a number of species of shorebirds at any given point in time in the year. And there's a very narrow spring peak, usually early to mid-May, when the peak of the spring migration pops through, and then a very long summer peak going from late July all the way into October when all these birds are moving south. And that's, of course, longer because the adults and juveniles are all together and actually migrating separately. So the adults come first, the juveniles come second. So you've got a couple of months of good shorebird viewing on the coast. It's nothing like Plum Island or Cape Cod, but it's what we got. And you can get 15 to 16 species of shorebirds in a day on a good fall day. Other than shorebirds, lots of other fun things in the Hampton Seabrook estuary. In the late summer and fall, we get these big influxes of herons and egrets from farther south, moving in post-breeding dispersal to forage in salt marshes. One of the salt marsh little wooded islands in the marsh in Hampton several years back started being used by night herons as a little roost in the fall. And at one point we had, I think it might have been 16 yellow-crowned night herons just in this one little island, which historically have been very scarce in the state, but now they're in that little spot almost every year. So that's a little fun thing. These marshes are actually also home to our largest population of sharp-tailed sparrows. Sometimes they can be hard to find because this marsh, there's not a lot of access to the actual marsh. There's a few places you can like pull over and try to listen, but there's not a lot of easy access to the marsh to walk out, for example, to try to get stuck in the mud. And across the bottom there is a little cobbled together panorama of a massive flock of tree swallows. It's probably nothing compared, if you guys ever been down to the lower Connecticut River in Connecticut where they stage in the fall. But if you look closely at this image, every single one of those telephone wires is lined with swallows. And I did actually kind of count them when I took these pictures, but I honestly can't remember what that number was. But every September, part of the giant swallow staging area that happens also in Plum Island spills over into the New Hampshire coast. And you can either be on the shoals or be down here in Seabrook and see thousands and thousands of tree swallows hanging out in the marshes and the dunes. This is also the only place in the state where we have nesting purple martins. So we'll move. Oh no, we're not. We're still on the estuary. Some of the salt marsh and the harbor. There's also our limited beaches areas. Again, most of which are public. Sometimes you have to pay to get into them, but you can get there and on a day when there's no people, you can see birds. Most of the best birding here is in the off season when the people aren't on the beaches, and you can usually find snowy owls. One of the big parking lots near one of the beaches is home to usually bunches of snow buntings, horned larks, and occasionally Lapland longspur, like the little guy we see here. And in the summer, it's home to piping plovers and least terns, and that's when it gets a little crazy because fishing game has to, keep an eye on these little guys, fence off their nests, keep people and dogs from disturbing them and so forth. And as in any place where plovers are on the East Coast, there's all sorts of little battles about whether they should have fireworks and whether they taste like chicken and all that sort of thing. But the beach and dunes part of Seabrook is also can be quite good for birding, mostly in the off season. You dodge the crowds first thing in the morning to see your plovers, or go in April. I saw one there a couple weeks ago. We'll move in from the immediate coast. It turns out I don't have a good picture of Great Bay, but this is part of it, which is our largest estuary. It's actually a very rare inland estuary, where there's a very narrow river that exits it and comes out to the coast in Portsmouth. And so water comes in and out that river around the corner into Great Bay twice a day. And that river, because it's sort of a constricted tidal thing, is one of the fastest tidal currents in part of the Gulf of Maine, and a little treacherous if you were going to try to do it in a canoe or something like that. But the Great Bay is a very rich estuary environment and has its own share of fun birds, both in the aquatic part itself and in some of the nearby areas. As far as the water birds, it's most famous for wintering concentrations of waterfowl. Usually these are lesser scaup, but I don't have a good picture of greater scaup, but there's usually a flock of, over 1,000 greater scaup, lots of Canada geese, lots of widgeon. The occasional canvasback or redhead or tufted duck has shown up on Great Bay with the flock of scaup in the wintertime. And just downstream of Great Bay is the very famous Exeter sewage ponds, as sewage ponds tend to be famous, which is where these black-bellied whistling ducks were found a couple of springs ago. It's also been home to tufted duck and black tern and Wilson's phalaropes and all sorts of things, but unfortunately right now it is closed to birders because of a Department of Labor inspection that no one's quite figured out why that has to do anything with birder access, but the plant manager is very sympathetic to the birders wanting to be there, and they're still working on whether they can get permission to get back in there. Right now you just go to the gate and you can look through it, one of the three ponds. Great Bay is also home to a pretty good osprey population. It was one of the first places ospreys came back to after they'd been decimated by DDT back in the 70s. And now there's ospreys all over the place. You can see 3 or 4 nests from some locations. Around the edges of Great Bay, there's also some upland habitats that have some special things if you're in that area. First of which is the Pease International Airport. It used to be a military base. It's just outside of Portsmouth. It is the only place in the state that has upland sandpipers. And there's a couple of spots along the perimeter of it that you can park and scope out, looking the runways, looking for these guys. And in the winter, sometimes there's rough-legged hawks or something like that. There's probably the state's largest grassland in that sense. Also, just in this area, there's lots of shrubby areas in the town of Durham and nearby that hold things like blue-winged warblers, which are near their northern limit here in southeastern New Hampshire. And that I could quiz people on this, but no one's going to get it right, because that flycatcher on the right is actually a hybrid between probably a Couch's kingbird and a scissor-tailed flycatcher. And it showed up near north of Great Bay a 3 years ago, and spent like several weeks there, and just was a totally bizarre, cool bird. You can kind of see how it's got a long forked tail compared to what a kingbird would normally have. So random, because Great Bay is close to the population centers and lots more birders, it gets covered a lot, and people find unusual things there. There was a tropical kingbird there last fall. And a mountain bluebird there this over the winter. So just fun things showing up there. Now we're going to move inland, away from the coast into the bulk of the state, and sort of my stomping grounds are there in the center in Concord, where I live. But we've got a few sort of places inland from the coast. We'll mention things like Rochester, Pawtuckaway State Park, and World End Pond. I'm going to play with the Connecticut and Merrimack River valleys, and the Connecticut Valley, of course, will be near and dear to you guys. That's probably the easiest way for you to come up and experience some of the New Hampshire fun. And then a little farther north in the eastern part of the state is what we call the Lakes region, which has also got some fun highlights. So sort of run through a few of these. With Rochester, another famous sewage pond. This is the Rochester sewage pond, and adjacent to it is a former sewage pond that's been converted to town-owned land with a hiking trail around the two ponds, called Pickering Ponds. And between these two, the town of Rochester has a huge diversity of random fun things that show up. In the winter, there's a nearby landfill, and the gulls are just always going back and forth to like bathe and wash in the sewage pond, and then go back to the giant landfill to get lunch. And this flock of gulls probably has 5 species in it. There's usually a few glaucous and Iceland gulls, occasionally a lesser blackback, and there was a slaty-backed gull once and a glaucous-winged gull once. But those have reappeared. So it's also hosted most recently a Ross's goose up there in the center. And then just next door at the Pickering Ponds trails, we had a wood stork several years ago. That's actually that wood stork. It stuck around for a couple of weeks. And it's also another good spot in the state for some of these southern species like orchard orioles and blue-winged warblers and things like that. So between those two places, you can actually find a whole lot of diversity just within a couple mile walk. South of there, there's a picture. taken from one of the summits in the Pawtuckaway Hills in Pawtuckaway State Park. This is an old volcanic ring dike situation where this is sort of very circular looking patch of mountains in the middle of a flatter coastal plain. And as a result, it's actually a great place for some northern species that aren't normally found in the immediate coastal area, like hermit thrush and junco. And it used to be home to the only place in the state to find cerulean warblers, but they disappeared about 10 years ago and haven't been around. But it's also a great place for lots of just good forest birds, American redstart and yellow-throated vireo here. And then to the south of it, there are two more good places, more for water birds. One is the Deer Hill Wildlife Management Area, which is right off of 101 between Manchester and the seacoast. It is home to the state's largest number of breeding pied-billed grebes, usually just 4 to 6 pairs in there. And also just a great place for migration and birding in general. If you do it before mid-July when the grass gets tall on the trails and it's crawling with ticks. And then down the Mass border, not too far from Haverhill, Mass, is World End Pond, which is accessible only by boat, except for a very tiny spot. And to take a boat on there, is one of the reliable places in the state for least bittern and sora. There's marsh wrens there, and it can be a great spot for other water birds during migration. All right, now we're going to head in the river valleys. This is the Connecticut, just across the river from Bellows Fall, Vermont. And the Connecticut and Merrimack are justly famous for all sorts of things, but probably they're most famous, at least this time of year, for waterfowl migration. You know, it's mostly wrapped up now, but starting in late February, you know, all the waterfowl that are wintering down in Connecticut or farther south are starting to move up these river valleys and will pass through, you know, the narrow floodplains of both the Connecticut and the Merrimack. And, you know, you get the usual mix of species. There's always going to be a few weird things, you know, that aren't super common in this part of the world, like these couple of northern shovelers. Get even a couple of weirder things. Whoa, what the hell just happened there? Okay. This is a pink-footed goose. I'm guessing there must be some fairly getting regular pink-footed geese down in the Connecticut Valley in western Massachusetts as well. But they're getting every couple of years now, one shows up in the Merrimack or the Connecticut. The Connecticut's way better than the Merrimack, by the way, for these random waterfowl migrations. And later in the spring, other water birds will also be funneling up the rivers, again, mostly the Connecticut. And one of the more unique things that's been there was this last spring I was down there, just north of the Mass border in the town of Hinsdale. There was an Arctic tern flying around in the middle of May in the impoundment above Vernon Dam. So for folks coming up the river from western Massachusetts, the first place you'll hit is in Vermont. You'll come up 91, presumably, is Brattleboro. But you cross the river in Brattleboro and go back down south the other side of the river, you'll get to the town of Hinsdale, where there's an old rail bed along the impoundment above Vernon Dam, and you can walk along that in spring and have all sorts of migrant birds in the trees and water birds in the water, and it's a nesting site for marsh wrens. Sometimes there's been at least bitterns in there, and it's just overall a very productive spot to go birding, probably less than an hour from where at least the Hampshire Bird Club folks are. Connecticut person's going to take longer. Another major feature of these big river valleys is our really nice floodplain forests, which, you know, tend to, you know, leaf out a little earlier in the spring because they're right by the rivers, and they're home to some species that are not widespread away from the river valleys, like blue-gray gnatcatcher. This is the other place where occasionally there's been a cerulean warbler in New Hampshire, is in Hinsdale. And the marshes in some of these backwaters are great places for other things like marsh wrens as well. Let me take a quick drink. One more slide about the river valleys, just to, you know, hit some other fun points. You know, they are by far the them plus the lakes region is the concentration zone for nesting eagles, which of course were almost extinct. Well, they were extirpated from the state. They were endangered. We know the story, but as they've recovered, they've just filled in along the river rise. In Hinsdale, that same place I just mentioned, there are 3 eagle nests within like a 4-mile stretch of that rail bed. The Connecticut River is also the main corridor right now for the expansion northward of black vulture. And they're starting to move up the Merrimack now as well. They're probably nesting in central New Hampshire, north of Hinsdale somewhere. We just haven't found it yet. And in fall, these river valleys are also the place to go to see the nighthawk migration, where on a good night you might see hundreds of common nighthawks milling around the valley on their way South America for the winter. So waterfowl in the spring, all sorts of cool breeding things in the summer. Nighthawks in the fall, waterfowl migration in the falls is much less interesting. And then in the winter, these places get kind of quiet because the rivers are mostly frozen above, except right around the dams. And, there's not as many things going on. So don't come into winter. Go to Long Island Sound into winter. Okay, between the Merrimack and the Connecticut River, so New Hampshire called the Western Highlands. You may have heard of Mount Monadnock, which is down near the Mass border. And so this is an area fairly undeveloped, very few people, lots of conservation land, lots of topography, and a great place to explore just for, sometimes some interesting birds. One of the fun things that goes on down here is one of our New Hampshire Audubon's partners, the Harris Center for Conservation Education, runs a hawk watch in a mountain called Pack Monadnock every fall. And, there they will see, the usual hundreds of broadwing hawks going through. They continue it into November, and each year they get several golden eagles if you're on the right day. So that can be, if you're into hawk watching, there is a reasonable hawk watch in Peterborough, New Hampshire, in the Western Highlands, part of southwestern state, New Hampshire. Some other fun things in the Western Highlands, that same organization is actually now banding saw-whet owls. That's not a thing that anybody can just go and join them at, but it's, these little guys are out there and having fun. This is the southernmost breeding area in the state for several northern species like Swainson's thrush, northern parula. There's suspicion of yellow-bellied flycatcher nesting in the Western Highlands. So you can sort of explore this, largely unexplored. There's lots of people go to the usual places, but there's little hills and chunks of forest and bogs that potentially have interesting things that no one ever looks for, including on the far right, an eared grebe that showed up at a tiny little wooded pond in the northern part of this region. That happens to be my sister's kayak because her camp is on this pond. And so we went out there, borrowed her kayak, went out and got to watch the eared grebe. So you just never know what's going to show up. And this was in the middle of July, not the sort of time you'd expect to find a vagrant warbird from the West. But that's part of the fun of birding, as we all know. All right, let's move into the lakes region. Famous for Lake Winnipesaukee, which is what this is a view from a little hill to the side, to the west of it. And if there's anything that, if you go to the lakes region and start wandering around, you're going to see, lots of little touristy stores, and they're all going to have loons on them because this is the central point for loon distribution in the state. I don't know how many there are at the moment, but, the statewide population is probably like 400 pairs. And there's probably about 100 of those in the Greater Lakes region itself, because there's some very large lakes, lots of coves for loons to nest in. There's also some fairly big marshes in the same region. One of the more famous is an Audubon property called the Thompson Sanctuary in the town of Sandwich, which is a great place for bitterns and Virginia rails, marsh wrens, snipe. Occasionally harriers are flying around in there. And in the winter, the lakes mostly freeze, but they get less frozen every year, it seems. The lakes that don't freeze tend to support some interesting mixes of waterfowl. Certainly the largest concentrations of goldeneyes away from the coast are in the lakes region. Usually there's a couple of barrows. This picture has some common goldeneyes, some greater scaup, and some white-winged scoters. This was during the Christmas count. in Laconia. So the area around Laconia and then just up the lake in Meredith, where there's some open water well into the winter, are great places in December and January, especially to go look for ducks without having to go all the way to the coast. Just north and east of Winnipesaukee are a couple more quick little areas. One is the town of Ospey, which is famous for the Ospey Pine Barrens, one of the larger expansive pine barrens, the largest one in New Hampshire, one of the larger ones outside of, the immediate coastal plain from Cape Cod down to New Jersey. And nearby also is the Saco River, which is another major river corridor going through the town of Conway and sort of at the gateway to the White Mountains. So Ossipee is particularly famous because it's the hotspot for whippoorwill in New Hampshire. We did some surveys there several years back, and just in this one stretch, there's an abandoned airfield that someone was building an airstrip in the middle of nowhere. It's about 1.5 miles long. We had 20 to 25 whippoorwills calling along that thing one night. So it's a great place for whippoorwills. Is also one of the only places nighthawks nest in the state. Lots of other shrubland birds like towhees. It's that's a bizarre picture on the upper right, but it's the northernmost reliable place right now for fish crow, which has been slow. Yes.
We have a question.
Yes, thank you, because I'm not reading.
Carol, you want to unmute your mic and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Pam.
Hi.
This is awesome.
Thank you. I'm glad.
You're welcome. And I don't know what a pine barren is.
So a pine barren, that's good. That's the kind of question, blah, 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 blah. What is she talking about? Pine barrens are a unique little natural system that tend to have pitch pine and some scrub oak, which are two species that are adapted to really dry, sandy soils and fire. So the nearest thing to you guys is the Montague Plains in Gill, Montague, Mass. So they tend to be not very tall. If you go back to this picture, these trees are scraggly, they're kind of spread apart. This one was recently harvested and burned to simulate the natural succession. So it's a unique habitat that's only found in very well-drained soils. Cape Cod is covered by pine barrens, for example. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So the other fun thing about this region is the Saco River, as I mentioned, which is actually home to some of the larger bank swallow colonies in the state. It's again a large river. It's not in a major urban area like the Merrimack, and so a lot of bank swallow colonies there are doing fairly well, although they're still at risk for things like caving in. And just recently learned of a project that they need to put some bank stabilization in right next to a colony. That colony might end up having to relocate itself to hopefully find another bank in the future. So that's, I think, the last slide I have for the southern half of the state. Conway is literally about halfway up the state. So it's everything north of Conway now that people from out of the state really want to check out. And that's the North Country, which we can divide into two sections here: the White Mountains, and then what the state tourism board calls the Great North Woods. We tend to just call the North Country, or we'd say Coas County. So we're going to start down here in the White Mountains, and then slowly work our way north. So here we are. There's the presidential range in spring. There's probably still a lot of snow up there now, and if there is a bird in New Hampshire that people from outside New Hampshire want to see, it's this guy, which of course is, anyone know what this is? I'll put it in the chat.
Nobody has written anything yet.
Nobody's trying to guess.
Yes, we
there
have
go.
one.
Brian. Brian wins. Oh yeah, this is Bicknell's thrush. Bicknell's thrush is only found in the mountains of the Northeast, from the Catskills, where it's getting very rare, up into Quebec. It used to be on Mont Greylock, but it hasn't been there for decades now. It used to be in southern highlands of New Hampshire. It hasn't been there. So the White Mountains is actually probably the global stronghold for pig-nosed thrush. You know, they think there's about 100,000 birds of these, 100,000 of these in the world, and probably 15 to 20,000 of them might be in New Hampshire, because we've got this big chunk of mountains. The Adirondacks have a bunch, Vermont has a bunch, but pig-nosed thrush is, people come up to New Hampshire to find pig-nosed thrush because it's very easy. You just drive up 91, take a turn, end up in the White Mountains. But because they're only found above 2,500 feet, they're not like you could drive up to one. So you have to hike a mountain, or there are two ways of getting to pig-nosed thrush without hiking up a mountain. And one of those is the Cannon Mountain Tramway, which is in Franconia Notch. People may have at least heard of the Old Man of the Mountain, which fell down a while ago, so it's not there. But you can take a tramway that the ski area runs in the summer up to 4,000 feet, and then you can get out and walk around at your leisure. And if you're lucky, you can hear or see a pig-nosed thrush. The problem is that the tram doesn't operate until 9 o'clock in the morning, and pig-nosed thrush is most active near dawn. So people see it that way, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. The other place to find them with some reliability is Mount Washington, which has, of course, a road going up it. And you can drive that road yourself. Again, it doesn't open until, I'm not sure when, except a couple of times each summer when they open at before sunrise. You can get up to the top of Mount Washington to watch the sunrise. But they also have pig-nosed thrush tours where people get on a bus, you know, and take the bus up with a guide, and they'll stop when they get to the right habitat, and they will try to find you a pig-nosed thrush. So those are two ways of doing it, other than hiking up the mountain, which of course isn't for everybody. But that's where they are, and they start showing up in late May, and they're there vocalizing into July, and then they'll be lurking into early September, and then they disappear back to the Caribbean. So if you want to look for pig-nosed thrush, now you know. While you're in the mountains, there's a few other fun things, but at this point, you know, the other mountain birds are going to be very similar to the other birds to the north, with a couple of exceptions. Whoops, no, it's not advancing on me again for whatever reason. There we go. Far to the right is an American pipit. This one's not on Mount Washington, but this is the only place, one of two places, excuse me, in the northeastern United States where pipits actually nest. They're mostly a bird of the tundra, or in the west in the Rocky Mountain alpine areas. Well, Mount Washington is an alpine area, and then the other one is Mount Katahdin in Maine, and both of them have populations of breeding pipits. There's about a dozen pairs of pipits every year that nest on Mount Washington, the southernmost breeding population east of the Rocky Mountains. And you can drive up there and you can wander around and try to find them. The whites are also home to an increasing fox sparrow population in the middle. You know, this is another northern boreal species that's been slowly expanding its range south in opposition to people's thoughts about climate change. And, you know, it's getting fairly reliable in the high elevation parts of the White Mountains where there's lots of scrubby spruce and fir that it kind of shows up in. Also, it's a terrible picture because I don't have a good picture of a male of a blackpoll warbler. These guys also reach their highest densities in the same habitat as the fox sparrow and pig-nosed thrush up in the stunted crumholtz, the stunted spruce fir at the tops of these mountains, you know, above 2,500 feet or so. What's really fun sometimes if you take the tram up Cannon Mountain in the late afternoon when, you know, it's cooling off and birds will start singing, you can sometimes hear blackpoll warblers underneath you as you're driving up, as you're riding up in the tram. And of course, the whites are full of all sorts of other warblers. This is a black-throated blue warbler, one of the more common ones in large parts of the hardwood forests in the White Mountains. So now we'll shift a little bit north of the White Mountains to a very special spot. This is the only location, maybe other than the Isles or Shoals, I suppose, that has its own little call out here. This little spot is part of the White Mountain National Forest in the town of Bethlehem, called Trudeau Road. Just like the Canadian Prime Minister. It's a, you know, as you can see from this photo, it's got a lot of boreal trees. It's got spruce, fir, tamarack. There's this old railroad bed that goes through this habitat, so it gets very easy access. There's just park on the road, you walk in, and then you can start wandering around and trying to find good birds. It's best in the summer, of course, because in the winter it's a frozen solid wasteland. Mostly you'll get ravens from the landfill nearby and a few other things. But in the summer and in the winter, there's a few good birds here. Probably the most famous bird here is the black-backed woodpecker, shown here on the left, which, you know, there's usually one or more in there somewhere. It's just whether you're lucky enough to find them. My best birding friend and I, we go up there all the time, and that picture is the only one we've seen there together so far. And that was seen from our car as we were about to leave after getting out from hiking in February one year. It's also a great place in the right years when the white-winged crossbills have moved in. There's a big cone crop. They will breed there. You'd find them sitting on top of the spruce and fir trees singing whatever time of year it is when they show up. It might be February, it might be July. It's always kind of fun. And if you're there in the winter, you know, even though there's very few birds, I think we walked, snowshoed like 2 miles once in February and has 6 species. It's not the place to go in winter unless you're looking for finches. But there's always going to be some golden crown kinglets and a few chickadees, red-breasted nuthatches, and things like that. And in the summer, all sorts of migrants move in: parullas, Swainson's thrushes. Yellowbite is a very good place for yellowbite flycatchers and things like that. So it's just great diversity of habitats and well worth a visit if you're up in sort of middle part of just north of the White Mountains. And just north of there is another birding crown jewel, the Pondicherry Refuge. This is actually part of the Sylvia County National Fish and Wildlife Refuge. And it keeps growing, but at the core of it is Cherry Pond, shown here, which is actually the frontage of it is owned by New Hampshire Audubon. But then the Fish and Wildlife Service has been expanding out by buying land all around it to create this very beautiful preserved chunk of the North Country. And Pondicherry is good for basically anything. Again, in the winter, it's going to be pretty quiet because in the winter time, the birds are all gone except for the residents, and those are often kind of few and far between. But in addition to, so the water birds that are found there, you know, this is a piece of cedar swamp, which is another place for black-backed woodpeckers. There's extensive marshes around Pondicherry, which are home to Virginia rails and harriers, the southernmost nesting area for harriers in the state. And in the winter, this is often close to the southern edge of where some of the winter finches get. They used to come all the way down to Concord and western Massachusetts, and still do, but in far fewer numbers. But this past winter, this particular set of feeders at a friend's house near Pondicherry had over 100 evening grosbeaks most days this past winter. So, you know, if you want to find winter finches in New Hampshire these days, you definitely have to go north of the notches and make sure you do it in the right year, because they're obviously not there every year. But so Pondicherry has boreal species like black-backed woodpeckers, marsh birds, winter finches, nesting warblers, high-billed grebes, all sorts of things. So you can, you know, usually do a big sit there in October and find tons of birds. They do a field trip there in May and find tons of birds. There's a nice abandoned rail bed that's been made into a rail trail, and there's a viewing platform that's got all the little amenities, except you do have to walk into it about 1.5 miles from whichever direction you start. But it's well worth it. Okay, just a little ways east of this is the Androscoggin Valley, which comes out of the Androscoggin River, starts up in the Rangeley Lakes area of Maine, goes through a bunch of stuff, and then exits New Hampshire to the east out of the town of Gorham. It's a fairly good sized river. It has a very big Lake of Magog at the northern end of it in New Hampshire. And it's also got lots and lots of bogs. That's why I stuck a bog here as a little thing. And it's like Pondicherry and Tudor Road, you know, these places all start kind of blur together a little bit. They're all good for lots of the same things. So, you know, I kind of repeat myself here and there, but just gives it a bit of the flavor. The benefit of the Androscoggin Valley is it's got the city of Gorham, town of Gorham, city of Berlin. So there's actually the densest population centers in the North Country there. So there's actually more feeders and more plantings. And so you get this better area for some of the winter finches and eruptives like the Bohemian waxwings on the right. There are a few of them there this January, February. Usually through pine grosbeaks, evening grosbeaks, the winter finches will move down into that valley when there's feeders and things to hang out at. I threw a shrike in here just because I'm talking about winter, and shrikes are here in the winter, and it's always fun seeing them on top of pointy spruce trees. But in the breeding season, if you can survive the mosquitoes and the black flies, Lake Umbagog is really about the only place in the state where you can find nesting common goldeneye, like the ones down there in the lower left, a nice mom with her cute little babies. And in general, it's a very great area for waterfowl, for nesting waterfowl, ringneck ducks, mergansers, goldeneye, lots and lots of mallards and black ducks. The only recent nesting record of American widgeon in the state is from Lake Umbagog. So it's a great area for water birds. And then all these bogs and boreal forests are also great places for things like palm warbler, and again, scattered things like the occasional Canada jay, all the flycatcher, all those usual sort of boreal species. But if you want the boreal species, the place to go is Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is the northernmost town in the state. Most, if not all of it, is actually above the 45th parallel. So it's closer to the North Pole than it is to the equator. And it's just cool. It's beautiful. So it's not all spruce fir pointy trees, but the parts that are some of the primo destination birding places in the state. So this is the Connecticut River, by the way. Starts just south of the border in a little tiny pond, and then trickles down, gets bigger and bigger as it goes, and eventually becomes the thing that goes through Hampshire County, Massachusetts. So, and up in Pittsburgh are lots of good things. And one of the reasons people go to Pittsburgh is to see these guys. So spruce grouse are in the White Mountains. They're in the Androscoggin Valley here. They're not very common, but they're also very reliable in Pittsburgh. And this one is just a really fun story. There's a little campground that a friend and I camp in every year, probably about 4 miles south of the Canadian border. And this particular female spruce grouse landed in a tree above our picnic table and proceeded to hang out there eating buds for a little while, and then dropped down to the ground and walked behind our tent, and then wandered off into the woods. People go up there looking for spruce grouse. This spruce grouse just found us while we were cooking dinner. It's also a great place to find Canada jays. It's the same campground, Deer Mountain Campground. And you go up there in winter, and the Canada jays are around, and they're tame. They want to come eat your peanuts. And so we go up there in winter every now and then, and we don't camp because you can't, and it'd be freezing cold. But if you hang out there in the parking lot long enough, and they'll figure out someone's there, and then they'll come in. And this one actually landed on my camera and just hung out there. There's boreal chickadees around as well. Not as many black-backed woodpeckers in my experience, but boreal chickadees and Canada jays are fairly reliable in the right places, and spruce grouse, if you're lucky. Both of these are also, and boreal chickadee are also found in the White Mountains, but again, you need to be hiking to find them. White Mountains are also full of warblers. It's where all the fun warblers nest in the state that you don't see except in migration to the south of the White Mountains, like bay-breasted warbler, mourning warbler, Wilson's warbler. The latter is pretty rare, but on a good spring day, you can find 15 to 20 species of warblers, during a wandering around in Pittsburgh, and all of them are nesting there. All the things that migrate north are nesting in Pittsburgh. So it's a great place for all these little warbler things. And, maybe not as dramatic, but Pittsburgh is also the state capital for cliff swallows, which are now listed as threatened in New Hampshire because our population is probably about a quarter what it was 30, 40 years ago. And here we've started putting little artificial nests up there to see if that helps them out. But there's a couple of colonies there with 20 to 30 pairs of cliff swallows on them. It's like, people don't go up there to see cliff swallows, but while they're there, they will. If they haven't seen a cliff swallow that year, it's a guaranteed place to find a cliff swallow. And I'll close with one non-bird, which is also a major draw for people going to Pittsburgh, and that's this guy. they actually, part of Route 3 in Pittsburgh is called Moose Alley. And every August, I think it is, they have a Coas County Moose Festival where all the northern towns kind of start doing things. They have little bus tours and all these other things so people can go see moose, which are, you know, they're up there and you can see them. So that covers my, let's skip this. Just in case anybody's interested, there is a book that a friend of mine wrote called Bird Watching in Hampshire, which covers probably a lot of the same ground. In case you, well, I was recorded, so you can just go back and listen. But I think it's in print, and you can probably get it on Amazon or who knows where else, in case you wanted another good reason to explore the state to your north. And at that, I'll be happy to take other questions and move the people screen back to where I'll flip to the side to see you.
So if you have a question, you can either put your name in the chat box or raise your hand so that I know, or just unmute your mic and we'll be gracious and go forward. So let's not be shy.
Yeah, don't be shy. I like the little picture of a toucan that's on Janice's screen right now.
Oh, it's a picture that somebody drew.
Yeah.
In Panama. Okay, Elisa, unmute your mic and ask your question. Elisa.
Okay. I just wondered if there are still any Mississippi kite nesting in New Hampshire.
Oh, yes. I should have mentioned those. Good call. Yes, that is one of the crazy, weird things that happened in New Hampshire about 15 years ago, maybe now. Mississippi kites started nesting in Durham, New Hampshire. You know, the nearest other place, I think at that point was Virginia. And they're still there. There's 3 or 4 pairs of Mississippi kites each year hanging around Great Bay. And it's just a really bizarre thing. And they're usually in someone's yard. So they're not, yeah, people usually keep the locations a little bit secret because the homeowners get a little perturbed when hundreds of people start coming by with their cameras and staring into their backyard trees. But they are there, they're not going anywhere. And they're slowly increasing. Probably some of the young from previous years have come back to set up shop nearby. Yeah, I should have a slide about them. That'd be a fun one to throw in there.
Thank you. Beth, go ahead and ask your question. I don't think there are several Beths. Go ahead, Beth.
Hi, I was just wondering, what is your favorite area to bird in New Hampshire?
So I'll answer this tangentially because people often ask, you know, what's your favorite bird? And I know a friend who says the one I'm looking at. And so I would almost be tempted to say where I'm going next.
Okay.
But I don't have a favorite. Trudeau Road is up there. Because it's, you know, I live in Concord, which is conveniently located sort of the middle of the southern 2/3 of the state. So I can get to the Connecticut River, the coast, the White Mountains, or even Boston within an hour and a half. So I can get to all these places. So Trudeau Road is up there. My little local patch here in Concord on the Merrimack River is also one of my favorite places to go, actually. And of course, I always like, the coast is good, but everybody goes to the coast, so it's not always my favorite. But yeah, Trudeau Road or Concord or something. The ones that pop to the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Elaine has a question, but before Elaine asks the question, so where are you going birding next? Since that's your favorite place, it's like, tell us where you're going because maybe we'll show up.
So tomorrow morning, me and a colleague at Audubon are giving a program at a high school just south of Manchester. So I am going to get up early. That doesn't start till 9. I'm going to get up early, drive a little bit south of there to the town of Merrimack, New Hampshire, which is just south of Manchester. On the Merrimack River, there's a little oxbow pond there called Horseshoe Pond, appropriately enough, that can be good for ducks and maybe some early migrants, and I'll see what's there.
Thank you. Thank you. Elaine, go ahead and ask your question.
All right. Hi, Pam. Thank you for the
Hello.
talk.
You're
It was
welcome.
excellent.
Thank you.
Is there a bird club in the Rockingham County area?
The fun thing about New Hampshire is that we have very few bird clubs. I'm not sure why that is. And the ones I know about, I don't know much about, for whatever reason. There is not one on the seacoast. There is the closest thing we've got, I guess it would count as a bird club, is the Seacoast chapter of New Hampshire Audubon. So if you were to look them up online, they have monthly talks. They have lots of field trips. They're a very active chapter. So I guess that would be and they include Rochester, that part of the state. So,
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
Anyone else? We have lots of comments for you, Pam. Excellent overview of birding in New Hampshire. Thank you. Great job. An impressive list of places and potential birds to see. And again, more thank yous.
I
Could-
think
Could
Pepper has a
could I
question.
ask?
Yes.
Do people report on eBird so that gives you a clue of good places to go and what you might see?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Most people are reporting on eBird. So yeah, if you use eBird, you can use it to look at hotspots or go look at recent records for a given county to know what's going on. And I'm snooping on eBird all the time. Because right now my girlfriend and I are basically trying to stay number 1 and 2 in Merrimack County for the year. And so someone found an ibis yesterday about 7 miles from my house, and so this afternoon she was on her way back from doing an errands, and I met her down at the pond, and we found the ibis. So
Excellent.
so it's also because I'm a big fan of local birding as well, and so it's very fun to just stay within the city of Concord and stuff like that. And eBird helps me with that. I just subscribe to my eBird alert for the year now for Merrimack County. Because stuff's coming in now. I'm not going to worry about broadwing hawk, but if someone sees another ibis or something bizarre, I need to know about it a little sooner than somebody else mentioning that they found it again, which is what happened today. So what ibis?
Okay. Anything else? Anybody have another question? Do you have? I have a question.
Go for it.
Are your slides available so we can see some of the places to go, which had the names of where, like Trudeau Road or?
Well, yeah, you can look at the recording.
Yeah, they'll be
Oh,
recording.
okay, that's right.
Yeah.
You just have to fast forward through it or something.
All right,
Otherwise, yeah,
that'll be fine. That'll work.
that'll be good. That way you can
Yep.
refresh yourself too, rather than, because without me babbling, sometimes you don't, what the hell is going on with this picture? I don't know what this is.
My other question is, if we decide, let's say a couple of us decided to go birding in New Hampshire, could we contact you ahead and say, would you take us someplace? Would you guide us? Would you, I don't necessarily mean for free, but like.
Right, well, yeah, I knew you, it would depend. I also, if you did, I could also put you in touch with a friend of mine who actually does that. He's
Okay.
retired and he does guiding. And he would be more than happy to take people anywhere that they want to go.
That sounds great.
I can even put his name in the chat.
Do
I
that.
can figure out,
Do
I can
that.
figure out where the chat went.
The chat is still where it was.
Well, yeah,
initially.
but I've lost it. I'm gonna close my thing and see if I can. No, there it is. Because I was still screen sharing it, and it disappeared, and now I just clicked it, it disappeared again. All right, let me see. I'll just have to sneak into my email so I can pull his email address up.
I will tell an interesting story, Pam.
Well,
How
yeah,
did
go for it.
How did we find you? So I was monitoring who was going to see our Smith's longspur,
Yep.
right? And so like, because it kept popping up on our eBird alert, right? And
Yep.
I like, oh, look at, here's this person and look at what she does in New Hampshire. So I said, Leslie, here's somebody we might want to contact. So that's how we found you.
That's how we found
Well,
you.
there we go. I'm glad it worked out. Yeah, I'm putting this guy's thing in the text. that should
Oh,
be
great.
good.
Thank you.
In the chat, I meant the text.
That's-
So yeah, he's a great guy. He was just guiding somebody a couple of days ago, I think. So yeah, he'll if you want, he'll do whatever he'll work with you to do whatever kind of random thing you want to do.
Okay.
And if
Well,
he's
thank
not
you.
free, I suppose I could figure something out, but I haven't actually done any of this in the past.
Well, this is great to have his name. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah,
And they can give me a cut.
that's right. Because you were the key.
No, I'm happy to help him out. He's a nice guy.
No, but sometimes, you want to go someplace, but you're like, yeah, she gave us the tips, but we're still like,
We don't know how to get there or where the road is or where the trail is.
yeah.
Yeah.
So this is great.
There is I don't know where it is, but there's a wiki for eBird hotspots in New Hampshire as well that sometimes has information on them. Let's see, the guy Ken Ostenmeyer or something like that's been doing. So if you Google eBird hotspot wiki, you might find it. And that might also be a useful resource beyond just like the eBird hotspots, which are just little blobs on a map that don't give you any information about,
Yeah.
how they do it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Pam. This has been terrific.
I'm glad.
We're
So
gonna
yeah,
do it.
you've been a good guinea pig audience then.
No, just
I might
great.
not need to change. I need to add the Mississippi kite things in, and I'll probably think of something else.
I have one tiny little detailed question.
Yeah,
You
please.
mentioned sharp-tailed sparrows. Are those also called seaside, salt marsh?
So I gave their old name. I haven't done that for a long time. So yeah, that was salt marsh sparrow.
Okay, I thought that's what it looked like. to me.
A good point. We were losing people now, but New Hampshire is one of the, Maine and New Hampshire, the only places where Nelson sparrow and salt marsh sparrow both co-occur.
Oh, wow.
And there's a spot on Great Bay, which I will also need to add to my talk to mention that they both occur there and they hybridize there.
Oh,
And
that's
people, UNH are studying them there. So they can be hard to tell apart nowadays down here because there's hybrids running around. But yeah, good catch on that one. I just blah, 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 blah. Sharp-tailed sparrow. Yeah, that's not a thing anymore.
We were lucky to have a Nelson's here in Hampshire County last year for about 3 weeks.
Was it one of the inland ones, probably?
I don't even,
Yeah, because there's a subspecies that breeds on the Great Plains, and that migrates across. So if you see a Nelson sparrow inland, it's probably the brighter ones that nest up in North Dakota and Saskatchewan and Montana and stuff like that.
I never heard. Anybody hear that?
Because the other,
Brian, you're still on. Did you ever hear that? About the Nelsons?
Scott called it an inland sparrow, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
that'd be my guess, because the ones that breed on the ones that nest on the Gulf of Maine coast into the Maritimes, they kind of just migrate, down along the coast. I've seen Nelson's inland in Concord, and they've always been the inland subspecies. So I don't know. I don't know what the one you guys had was, but that would be my guess.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you, guys, and
Okay.
enjoy your birding. Go birding
Oh.
to your favorite place tomorrow, wherever it is.
All
It's
right,
not gonna be
we
as
will.
windy. Take care.
And I will add, this yellow-throated warbler was found at Cranberry Pond. There's a blurb on